participants of the conference, and thank you for choosing this particular discussion panel. My name is Arek Osinski, and I look after Bloomberg business across Central Europe, Central Asia, and Caucasus state. And I will have a pleasure of moderating today's panel. And we are going to talk about a ESG disclosure and ESG disclosure as well as commitment to international standards in our Central Asian countries as well as in the world. So I'll do a quick introduction, introduce the panelists, and then we'll jump straight into our hopefully very interesting and in-depth conversation. So I will have a pleasure of moderating our discussion, our panel, with our esteemed guests and specialists in this particular topic. So we'll have a pleasure of hearing from Natalya Khoroshevskaya, the Deputy Chairman of Management Board of Kazakhstan Stock Exchange, Medetbek Nazaraliyev, President of Kyrgyz Stock Exchange, Oleg Shvyrkov, a Director of Nestor Advisors, and also online will join us Jerome Lavigne-Delville, a Chief of Standards Development at SASB, an IFC disclosure expert. So I guess what we're going to do today, we are going to talk about the regulation that affects our green agenda, the ESG ratings and how to interpret them, the challenges in the market and greenwashing, and some of the methodologies behind the scores that third-party providers show to the market. I guess we would like to keep this very practical. I guess for the whole day, you probably heard a lot about theory and how it affects what we do in the market, but we try to keep it very practical, to talk about some examples and see it from the eyes of the investors. And I guess from my perspective, it's also quite interesting because all those ESG conferences tend to highlight the fact that we preach to the converted. So I will come on stage and I will tell you how important ESG is, and then you sit over there and you say, yes, it is important. So I think what we are trying to do, we're trying to showcase some of the challenges things like ESG reporting, disclosure, and commitment to international standards have. So without further ado, actually, there's one more technical announcement I'm supposed to make, so apologies for that. You have access to a live feed to be able to ask questions to the panelists. So you see a QR code on the screen which you can scan, and you can also join our Telegram bot channel that will open on your phones, and you'll be able to ask the questions. Online participants will be able to do exactly the same through our online channel. So that's all the administrative stuff done. Let's move to the discussion. So let me hand over the floor to Oleg, who will present a few things about the evolution of ESG standards. Oleg, if you may.
Thank you, Arek. Добрый день, уважаемые коллеги.
Good afternoon, esteemed colleagues. My name is Oleg Shvyrkov. I am the CIS Director of Nestor Advisors. This is not my first visit to Almaty, but still I would like to thank IFC and the organizers for this opportunity to speak in front of you. I would like to talk about the following. How is ESG-related information provided by companies used by investors? So we specialize in how companies interact with their shareholders. Every year we work, obviously, in more than 80 countries globally, and that allows us to understand what preferences investors have, including the ESG area. And I would like to share this information with you. But let me start with some background information, and let me talk about this slide a little bit more. So here you will see an evolution of how investors interact with public companies. First of all, we should be talking about investments here. In the upper part, you will see investment solutions. The second level is voting. The third level is engagement. This is how companies interact with investors. Let's go back to 2016-17. Those were the times when I visited Almaty for the very first time. Back then, funds, asset management companies, the decisions there were made by their front desks. Basically, portfolio management experts took such decisions without consulting any experts in any other areas. As for consulting, here we should be talking about the following. Decisions were made by the same portfolio managers, and in the majority of cases, they didn't have enough time or resources to formulate a certain position. Many companies back then, funds and asset management companies, did not vote at general meetings. As for interaction between companies and investors, it centered on, obviously, financial results. And that's how interaction between companies and investment looked like 15 years ago. After that, certain major events took place. And I would like to talk about our region and the CIS countries, more specifically about Kazakhstan. Corporate governance risks, and back then nobody talked about ESG, were perceived as major material risks by investors. As for developing markets generally, and the CIS countries more specifically, everybody did the following work. They tried to pay more attention to corporate governance risks of certain companies. Then in 2017, the first European directive was adopted on shareholders' rights, and it basically banned any limitations on electronic voting. And it became cheaper for investors to vote in those markets where they were not physically present. And more investors started voting at general meetings, and that impacted sort of the quality of interaction between investors and companies. In 2009, the global financial crisis took place, and it actually also centered around problems of corporate governance, especially in banks. And the corporate governance problem became more noticeable, and investors to a larger degree started paying attention to governance practices in companies, corporate governance practices. In many or some companies, corporate governance experts started to work. And if you look at the lower level in our table, at the lower row, you will see that corporate governance roadshows started to take place, during which investors had access to information about those measures that companies took in order to minimize corporate governance risks. In 2016, we have the Paris Agreement. Governments of major countries under the auspices of the UN finally developed those common sustainable development goals, and the ESG sort of concept and idea became more visible, and it became part of investment decisions and voting procedures. And so during the pandemic, also attention was paid to certain social aspects, such as corruption, illegal labor, etc. And so now investment decisions are taken under a different procedure and with a different set of priorities by investors. Let me talk a little bit more about this. This table will show you how decisions are made by asset management companies and funds. Interaction between shareholders and companies took place initially through the front office. At a certain point in time, suppliers of external information who represented recommendations, in other words, proxy advisors, became more influential during the global financial crisis of 2007 and 2008. Some companies started hiring corporate governance consultants that consulted investment funds and other companies on issues of voting at general meetings. So now we find ourselves in the following situation. Apart from consultants or voting consultants or proxy advisors, we have other external participants, such as suppliers of ESG ratings and indices. The front office still involves managers, but in many companies, investment funds, we have like a separate position for ESG officers or ESG team members. They comply, they are responsible for investment decisions and how investors interact with companies. And so basically this evolution is taking place throughout one generation. And perhaps this graph doesn't show you everything in detail, the whole process, the whole evolution. But if we delve into this topic, ESG topic, and how investors work with companies, we will see this picture. When we talk about increasing information needs of investors who have more resources now in order to analyze information, they have their own subdivisions. Some major ones at least have these people who are responsible for analyzing information. They are actively involved in voting, and investors take advantage of their right to include certain items on agendas of general meetings. And in most cases, these items relate to climate change. So here we will see results of a survey of investors globally. And the top priority question here is the climate change question. The majority of investors said that they're concerned about this. Composition of board of directors and their effectiveness is second most important. Human resources is the third important issue, and then the pandemic impact is the fourth important question for investors globally. Let's take a look at the format of how information is presented. We discussed many formats for disclosure of non-financial information. The most popular, in the opinion of investors, and the most easy to use is the ESD format. I looked at Courier research for results in Kazakhstan. GRI is more popular here. Only 15% use FDR. So I think the evolution of standards will take place, and the evolution of how information is provided to companies. The second most preferable format is SASB. Half of investors are prepared to use that format. And then we have some specific standards that deal with ESG. We also have a separate question of intermediaries who work between companies and investors. Those are suppliers of external information as ESG ratings and rankings. Those are organizations who deal with those things. The sector, or the ESG rating industry, is a relatively young industry, and those are relatively young products. In May 2022, a major event took place whereby Tesla was excluded from the ESG index of S&P 500, and a lot of questions were raised. The company is the biggest manufacturer, and they are excluded from this index, but McDonald's and ExxonMobil are still there. And McDonald's, actually, their carbon emissions are larger than anybody else. So why was this decision made? And comments were made by S&P. They said they were dissatisfied by issues relating to labor at certain enterprises. There was some discrimination cases. They were not happy with Tesla carbon emissions. They were not happy with how the company interacted with the regulator with respect to accidents that took place in the US. And so all these issues were raised by the rating agency. But as for the other manufacturers, that didn't happen to them, and Tesla remained in other indices. And so one of the problems of this young industry is this huge discrepancy that we have in their positions. So old products that are 150 years old, so the correlation is more than 90%. And the correlation between corporate governance indices is statistically insignificant. So we need to understand there is no methodology, there is no approach. Many ESG ratings and indices are sort of given without interaction with the company and without any analytical data, on the basis of technical scoring only. That's why we get this picture that we have. So when a major event takes place, there are different positions in the market, there are different positions of different suppliers, and so this aspect made the regulator unhappy. The British regulator, FCA, demanded that rating agencies use various ESG ratings, and they declared that they will regulate ESG ratings in terms of their methodology. And such announcements were also made by the European Union. Last year, there was this discussion of ratings, and based on that discussion, EU came with recommendations whereby regulation of ESG ratings needed to be introduced. There are very many ratings. They put pressure on issuers, and it's not always clear which or what methodology reflects correctly those risks in ESG that are important for investors. Therefore, if we want to conclude the conversation about the ESG rating, we need to understand two things. This is a young industry. Perhaps consolidation, methodological or structural consolidation will take place. We will have fewer rating agencies, and this industry will be regulated. Until then, we shouldn't rely on external ratings as the only source of ESG activities of a company. So we need both sort of external and internal source of information. And that's what this global research study, which I referred to earlier, tells us. Now, what should issuers do in this area? Apart from disclosing non-financial information, you also need to talk about what resources you have in order to address sustainable development issues. This slide will show you an example of how board of directors of largest banks of the world disclose their information. And here they have separate items, knowledge and expertise in sustainable development. Here we see Santander and Bank of America. In both examples, the banks showed that the majority of their board members do have expertise in this area, but usually investors require more detailed information. Who exactly has this knowledge and expertise, and why the bank thinks that this information is sufficient. As for the committees, usually when a company starts dealing with ESG, they create one committee, which is called ESG, or Sustainable Development Committee. And usually this committee works for some time in order to resolve sort of all issues relating to ESG for the board of directors. And then after that, other committees start dealing with this.
And disclosure is also relates to the audit committee. The compensation issues are typically driven to financial performance, and this is the best practice because this belongs to the Recognition and Awards Committee. As for the HR and Governance Committee, it is responsible for the board composition, and they are to take care that there are competent people within the board to manage the operations inclusive of ESG. And also, they have to make sure that ESG-related risks and sustainability risks are incorporated into the risk management structure of the organization. So what is recognized as a single topic in the very beginning Following the improvement and following the expansion of board's competences is then redistributed. This is the standard. I know that I'm abusing my time, but I would like to give the floor to other speakers. Let me give the floor to co-panelists because Arek is looking at me.
Very insightful, and I hope everyone finds it quite useful. I guess for my part, I'm very conscious that we don't want to do a death by PowerPoint and keep showing you slides, but I just wanted to give you an idea of what sort of Oleg discussed and how some of this stuff look in practice and what challenges investors face when thinking about ESG data, where to find it, which data points are valuable, and how actually use it in practice. So I wanted to give you a bit of an insight on how what investors look like when evaluating a company or a government or a country when they talk about ESG. So my slide is titled ESG Data and Analytics, because that's what we as Bloomberg specialize on, providing transparency to financial markets. And Oleg obviously mentioned ESG scores, and there's plenty of problems with those ESG scores, and we've heard this expression throughout today's session. So I wanted to actually show you how they look like, how they actually are conducted, or how they actually are put together, and what do they actually mean to investors. So those are the probably 4 things we'll talk about, and I might actually skip the last part, which is the regulatory environment, because I'm sure you've heard about regulation a lot today, and I'm not really sure if that's the best subject to cover at 5 p.m. on Wednesday. So to start off with data types, there's quite a few things on this slide, but I think the main thing I wanted to draw your attention to is the last part, which is the biggest challenge we have now. I think there's so much data being produced that it's very difficult to know which data points are important and which should be used within our evaluation process. So when we refer to 4,000 ESG fields or data points, it's not the whole universe. It's 4,000 data points per one company if this company is actually publishing some of the data. So it's obviously a lot of data to go through and understand the true ESG credential. And we've talked a lot today about greenwashing, and I think that's one of the first steps we have to think about, how transparent we are as governments, as data providers, as companies, and how committed we are to international standards as well. And in terms of actually data types, there are 3 types of data that you probably find within either Bloomberg or any other platform or that are out there. First of all, you've got company-reported data. So, for example, company will report their greenhouse gas emissions. Company will report things like percentage of women in management boards, which is obviously a very important statistic when it comes to the social aspect of our ESG acronym. And we also have derived data, some estimates. So how do we estimate some of the stuff when company fails to report this information or doesn't really know how to do it? And we also classify things like third-party data. So for us, it's things like MSCI rating, Sustainalytics, S&P, et cetera, et cetera. And just to give you an idea how it actually looks like, so when the investor opens what they will call Bloomberg Terminal, you can see this is the data that a company will report. I've chosen a company that does reporting very, very well, and it's sort of between our world and Western European developed countries. So it's actually an oil company based in Poland. And you can see on the left-hand side all the data points that we collect about this company, and also at the very top you can see disclosure scores we're going to discuss in a bit more details. But just to give an idea what it actually is and how it looks like, and what's the starting point for evaluating company like this one. And also where this company comes from, where this data comes from. So when I spoke at the very beginning, I've mentioned that we've got company-reported data. So you can see an example of a non-financial disclosure for a company, basically saying what are the carbon dioxide emissions, which are highlighted in yellow on this slide. So this is how it's reported by the company. That's where the data is taken from and presented to the wider audience. And then the second part is the derived data, so things like ESG scores, things like estimates. So I can see stuff highlighted in red, so that's where derived data is published, or how it's published. And you can see the two bigger parts are actually the scores itself, which we're going to talk a bit more about in a sec. But just to give you an idea of how it looks like, where to find it, and what it actually means. And last but not least, the third-party data. So for us, it's anything outside of what we produce. So there's obviously a lot of stuff that is produced, as Oleg said, by various rating agencies, in quotation marks, because it might be just data providers that come up with their own scores based on some sort of methodology. And methodology is something we're going to talk about as well, because that's quite important for market participants, for companies to understand how the ESG scores are combined, how they evaluate, how rating companies evaluate those scores, and how do they present them. And also a bit about emissions. I think greenhouse gas emissions, obviously, that's a big focus. Probably when you think about ESG, you probably think about the letter E, and greenhouse gas emissions are something that everyone tries to focus on. I'm guessing some of us are following COP27 and developments over there, and there's a lot of talk about what are the countries' emissions, how do we decrease them, how do developed countries contribute or don't contribute to development of the developing countries, and all this conversation. So you can see that some of the data you've got not only the emissions that are published by the company, but also what can be possibly estimated. And that's probably the very interesting subject, and probably I want to spend a bit more time on this. So ratings and scores. We did talk, and we're going to probably talk a lot about ESG scores and how they are presented and how they evolved, and something that Oleg has touched on, that is very immature industry, not as mature as credit rating agencies, but we know all of this has its challenges. So we've seen this slide before. Is just where do you find those ESG scores? But what I would like to concentrate on is the methodology. And I can only talk about the methodology that Bloomberg implemented. Any data provider, any rating agency will have their own view on how the methodology should be combined. I guess what I'm trying to say is, and I'm guessing that's quite obvious for me to say, but I believe that we are quite unique because we always thought it's very important to bring transparency to the markets. So we not only tell you what the score is, but we also tell you what do we do to come up with this score and how we work this out. And you can see there are 4 key factors. It's materiality-based, so basically looking at the company and saying, for this company's core business, what are the most important factors? Quantitative-driven, so we tell exactly which data points we take to come up with this score. It's not subjective. We don't just go and have a subjective view on the company's performance. We take the data they actually report, put it in an algorithm, and produce the scores. That's why we're trying to be transparent. And the last bit is probably not as important in terms of how it works for investors. But you can see over here on the materiality base, you can see what points we actually take to come up with a score for a shoe manufacturer. That's the company you can see over here. And you can see this will be slightly different if I move to the other slide. If I take an oil company, you can see the left-hand side, the data points are slightly different because it's the part when I talk about materiality base. Different things will affect shoe manufacturer and a fossil fuel company. The second part is it's quantitative driven. So you can see exactly, for example, for the score for environmental, so for the E, which is the first part, we look at greenhouse gas emissions. And we exactly tell you what kind of data point we see and we take to come up with the score for E. So basically it's as simple as 1 + 1 = 2. A bit more complicated, but we feel that we should be providing a lot of transparency. So if the investor wants to come up with their own scores and compare it to what is given by a third-party provider, that's where you can obviously see stuff like this. So I think the quantitative-driven part is quite important to provide as much transparency to all the market participants. And another part on the transparency, you can see the actual methodology. So you can see the paper and say, actually, that's how we come up. So when I said 1 + 1 = 2, you can actually see what 1 is. Where do we take 1 from, and how did you come up with number 2 as a result? And on ESG scores, I think that one of the biggest challenges that we are facing with here from people in the market is how do we evaluate green credentials of a country, of a government? It's difficult to say what are the greenhouse gas emissions. You haven't got statistics like percentage of women on board. So we've got some data sets that might be quite useful. And something that we've heard throughout today's session is about the road to net zero. So what are what we call NDC, national determined contributions or targets, and how the country is doing on the road to achieve those targets they stated in a Paris Agreement or in COP in 2015. So that just gives you a bit more information about this particular topic. And last but not least, obviously at the moment we focus on companies, but there's also a big segment of the market, and it's getting bigger and bigger in terms of sustainable debt. So when we think about fixed income instruments, we think about, is this a green bond? And green obviously in the quotation marks, right? So what are the international standards that help investors evaluate, is this actually a bond that is sustainable, what that sustainability means, and how it actually works in practice. And I think that quite an obvious thing is that we obviously follow international standards, and everyone will do, which are standards developed by International Capital Markets Association. So we follow those global standards. You can see some extra details on this slide in terms of what kind of instrument it is. Does it have a green instrument indicator, just saying it's a green instrument? What are the principles it has aligned to? And do we have an independent assurance? And in a way it works that I can issue a bond and say, this is a green bond, so I can self-certify, but I can also explain the proceeds that I will get from issuing this bond will be directly contributing to one of the climate initiatives and actually state my prospectus what it actually is. And you can have a third party that will basically say, looking through this prospectus and say, does it actually qualify as a green bond based on the use of the proceeds? And there's few more bits where to find this information. That's one of the examples we can see on the right-hand side when we've classified the use of proceeds. And that's basically saying it's a green bond because you can see the green indicator on this particular sustainable debt part. I am very, very conscious I'm running out of time, and I'm sure you want to hear a bit more from our expert panel. So I will probably skip the regulatory part and hand this over to Medet to talk to us about how he feels about the whole subject from a perspective of the president of the Kyrgyz Stock Exchange. Medet, over to you.
Once again, I would like to welcome all of the participants of the workshop. I understand it's very difficult in the end of the day to digest such information, and I would like to share what kind of efforts are taken by Kyrgyz Stock Exchange and what are the trends of the stock market of Kyrgyzstan. Well, sustainable development of stock exchange in Kyrgyzstan started in 2020 in this post-pandemic period when we decided, in 2022, pardon, and this is where we decided that we need to develop new strategy. And the first step, well, we definitely supported UN's initiative on sustainable stock exchanges, and we have committed to do some efforts. On an annual basis, we complete some exercises. You see, we have some gender-related initiative, and within the scope of these initiatives, we elaborate on the role of women in the boards and about the role of women in the companies. And we kind of explain that women, they lead the companies in the private sector, in the government sector, and we also share statistics that in majority of cases, women work in the operations department, while our main point that we need to bring women to key leadership position. And this is why we have developed the guidelines for ESG disclosure. In order to for us to be successful, we were guided by UN's recommendation on ESG disclosure, and we also relied on the major standards that have been referred to today: GRI, SSB, and ESG standards by IFC. We have received expert support from IFC as related to the ESG agenda. I would like to thank IFC, Adliat, Jerome, Martina. Thank you so much, because indeed we ended up with a brilliant document, and the companies are planning to use it to disclose ESG information. Also, in Kyrgyz Stock Exchange, we have a dedicated section of sustainable development. The listing rules are also finalized, so the companies can enter the stock markets and start issuing social and green bonds. We have requirements to verifiers, requirements to the companies as related to ESG disclosure. So it's not only about requiring to comply with listing or some other processes, but we want the stock exchange to also commit for sustainable development and pursue sustainable development policy. So the efforts that we input convert to the situation when Kyrgyz Stock Exchange has a dedicated and committed company with ESG bonds that is fully compliant about climate bonds, that is fully compliant with Climate Bonds Initiative, that is verified by the Center for Green Finance and AIFC. So all of this is now converted into practical implementation, and this is where social and gender bonds are the most important.
Also, we have done a lot of joint work with IFC to make sure that this document is a workable document and it complies with international standards, so that companies who disclose non-financial ESG information are perceived by Western investors sort of correctly, so to speak, before they make decisions relating to investment in securities. And obviously here you will see how ESG can be deciphered, so to speak. The Kyrgyz Republic is a mountainous country, so we have companies in the energy sector, agriculture, telecommunications, etc. Financial sector, those are the sectors where ESG information should be disclosed according to our recommendations. And also, very briefly, throughout this conference, we see that many banks from Kazakhstan and financial companies, as part of their sustainable development policies, took on this obligation with respect to 14 goals for sustainable development. And for us, we made this decision. So we think that for the stock exchange, at the initial stage, 5 goals should be sufficient. And so we will focus on high-quality education, first of all, because of this high-quality education, we will not be able to raise awareness and to promote those notions of responsible investing and how companies invest. Also, we need to focus on gender diversity. We need to improve the level of corporate governance in companies, and we need to make sure that women play key roles in companies. And that way, we will help our country, Kyrgyzstan, in accordance with the Paris Agreement, to comply with all these requirements. And the private sector especially needs to be paid more attention to, because they use natural resources. And if those companies do not commit to these requirements, then the country will struggle sort of reporting back to the UN with respect to these goals. Also, we need to make sure that natural resources are used and utilized properly, and on an annual basis we need to report to shareholders and then to lead by example as to why we disclose this information. Thank you so much. Hopefully we haven't taken up too much of your time.
Thank you very much, Medetbek. That was very, very interesting, and thank you for that presentation. I I guess we are probably done with all the presentations in PowerPoint, and we want to move on to a discussion. So one person, there's two people we haven't heard from yet, which is Jerome and Natalya. So if I may, I want to just direct first question to Jerome. And with your background and your knowledge, can you just give us an idea of what are the actual benefits of ESG reporting for the companies and the overall benefits? And I do hope you can hear us. We can't hear you.
My name is Jerome Lavigne-Delville. I'm a senior consultant with the IFC. I've had the pleasure to work with the Kazakhstan Stock Exchange and on their ESG disclosure guidance. And I thought in the context of all the regulatory requirements around ESG reporting, it was important to convey that ESG reporting is not necessarily always a reactive exercise, and that actually there are a lot of benefit, external and internal, to reporting for companies, even though that can be perceived as a burden initially. The first thing I'd like to say is that oftentimes ESG reporting is a sign of companies adopting a more modern approach to business. And that can be quite attractive to investors and financiers externally, as we've heard from Oleg and Arek. But it is also beneficial internally to attract employees and better manage resources and risks. So just to build upon what Oleg was saying about the attraction to investors. Investors look at corporate governance, especially in the last 10, 15 years. And what we've seen is that ESG reporting more broadly, not just governance, but environmental, social, and governance reporting, and the quality of management of ESG issues is a sign, a proxy to investors on the quality of management and governance of the company. So in other words, investors perceive that if there is good reporting on ESG matters, then the company must be well managed and have proper governance, because these type of things don't happen alone. I also wanted to mention that we've heard a lot of talks about investors and maybe something that is relevant for publicly listed companies, but there's also a lot of benefits for private capital markets or companies who seek financing on the loan market with their banks, because banks are also increasingly pressured to report on the ESG management of their loan portfolio. So they will be asked either by their parent company or by their regulator, what is the impact of the companies that they give loans to or finance in general. And then a quick, fairly basic but important reminder that it is really important also for employees to know that companies manage ESG matters. First and foremost, ESG includes employee matters, so employees want to know how they're going to be treated. But it's also a matter of whether they want to be associated with a company based on how they deal with all these modern issues around climate, employment, fairness, etc. The same reasons make it very important for customers, and customers are increasingly wanting to know how companies perform on these issues, whether they are individuals or whether they are other business that must answer to their own customers. And so in closing, what I wanted to say is also pick up on something that Oleg said when he said that a lot of ESG ratings of companies are done without interacting with the company. I think that's true generally of the reputation of companies on ESG matters, that if you don't proactively communicate with your employees, your community, your investors, your banker about these issues, they're going to form an opinion no matter what. So ESG reporting is a way to be more proactive and to control a little bit the narrative that is forming about your company and how it addresses increasingly important sustainability matters.
Perfect. Thank you, Jerome. And I think that you've touched on a couple of very interesting points. And one thing I would like to pick up is something that Medetbek and Oleg said as well. And I'll probably direct this question to Natalya because we haven't heard from her so far. We talked about standards. We talked about what companies should and shouldn't disclose. And we know that obviously in European Union, we've got some clear regulation in this way. We've got EU taxonomy, we've got SFDR, but there's also plenty of data points. And one of the things is something closer to our heart is what is actually happening at the moment on our local, when I say our local exchange in Kazakhstan. Natalya, what do companies have to disclose and what do they actually do now? What are the standards you are trying to get your companies to apply?
Thank you very much for this question. And taking this opportunity and seeing Jerome, just looking into his eyes, I cannot skip this opportunity. And I need to thank Jerome and IFC team. Because, we were the pioneers in the region who were implementing ESG and disclosure agenda. And perhaps we were not the easiest client and not the easiest partner when we were developing our methodology. However, our counterparts from IFC, Jerome, Adalat, Madina, thank you very much, because they have joined us in our journey, which was quite challenging, and eventually we ended up with a good outcome. And, we have quite an extensive expertise and experience. Yes, we have joined UN initiative on sustainable stock exchange earlier than our counterparts. In 2016, we have published our first recommendation on disclosure in the field of ESG. And then we have revisited jointly with IFC, and it is currently pretty well mature, pretty valuable, and it is very highly of highest quality. It is not mandatory. It is voluntary to be observed. But similarly to other stock exchanges, we have listing companies, and we do have some specific terms for listing companies, and we definitely have requests from our clients from the other side, the investors, who are willing to expand the disclosure, but not in the financial performance side, but they would like to see the company's performance only. I'm talking about profit, about gains, assets, liabilities, but investors want to understand why and how these performance indicators are estimated. Investors also want to see to what extent the company is sustainable in its development path. They want to understand the decision-making structure, the quality of peer bodies, and other components to ESG, because it is social responsibility and it is environmental and impact produced by the emitter. So we have increased request and increased demand from the investors, inclusive of our domestic market. And therefore, it doesn't mean that we just jumped into the major attention to this particular issue. We work in this field for a while, and we have a clear understanding that we need to pursue the best practices of disclosure. And this relates to financial performance, non-financial, corporate events information, and so on. But I'm absolutely confident that we need to do it in a gradual manner, step by step. We shall not establish conditions for the emitters. This condition shall not be severe or unacceptable. We shall be guided to have the balance within the market and within the capacities of the company to disclose. I think we are pretty much successful because we are still supported by IFIs, And IFC is taking the key role, I would say, in our region, especially when we talk about disclosure. And I think IFC is the leader in terms of support in this area. They support all of our events in this field. This relates to recommendations, methodology, and in the end of the day, it is the securities placement, especially those ESG compliant. And I have repeatedly said, and I will continue to say, that international financial institutions in our region, they are not only the conductors or the carriers of the best practices in the field of disclosure or some other fields, but they also act as the role model emitters, because they demonstrate that issuing ESG security is possible. It is done this way. This regulation shall be complied. This information shall be disclosed. This shall be verified. This is a step-by-step procedure. We already have 9 emissions, and we have started from IFIs, international financial organization. We currently have Development Bank of Kazakhstan, Damu company, and one company from the real sector, Kyrgyz company, that has also issued similar bonds. It's not yet placed. We're expecting it to be placed. And taking this opportunity, I would like to congratulate you, Medet, with your first bonds issuance, first ESG bonds issuance. Indeed, it is a very good sign. It means that you have started your journey. The first emitter has succeeded, and they will be followed by others. And going back to answering your question, in our particular listing, the companies are split into 2 types and 2 platforms. We do have companies that represent major business. They focus on a larger range of investors, inclusive of those international. They already have to disclose non-financial performance related to sustainable development. They can use either the methodology that is recommended for others, and this is the methodology we have drafted jointly with IFC, or they can utilize our requirements to annual reports, and these requirements are drafted in accordance with GRI. However, every single year we are adding a piece by piece that are derived from the methodology that we currently have. So our in-house requirements are, in some words, expanded, and we are checking the readiness and maturity of the investor base, utilizing the recommendations that we have. I think that every single year the list of companies disclosing such reports will be expanding. Last year, we had 86 companies who have compiled such reporting, 86 listing companies, and I think we will have this number growing next year. Thank you.
Natalya, I think that's quite a few important points you've made. The baby steps you are trying to make, and you are obviously on the journey, but I think the important part is also this pragmatic approach, not to try to overwhelm your market participants with onerous or too onerous reporting standards. And before I let you go, I got one more question. And I don't want you to set a policy of Kazakhstan Stock Exchange, but will there be a requirement for non-public companies?
Well, this is another topic that is widely discussed. So far, from what I know and from what I see in the regulatory framework, it is very pleasant for us as for the stock exchange to see that the legislation and the framework for ESG project and associated financing is already existent. And we can work with this framework. By we, I mean the companies that are interested to do so. We have a new environmental code that has been adopted in the end of last year. This is going to be quite a complicated process of making it effective, because it is a stage by stage procedure. We already have green taxonomy, and any project must check whether their green status is compliant with the requirements of the regulator. The financial regulator is also working on introduction of the framework. The entire regulatory base is already prepared. Now they are defining the ways how to issue the green bond, whether it needs to be verified under particular circumstances, and so on. Talking about disclosure of ESG information, I also think that this approach is going to be pretty much weighed and very careful one, because we currently have the draft document by the financial regulator that demonstrates how financial sector companies shall evaluate their risks and how they shall disclose such evaluation, and how this information will be formalized and how it is going to impact the company's performance. So I think that a development of the regulatory framework for mandatory disclosure will be driven, as it is validated and evidenced by earlier performance. It will be driven by the capacity and maturity of the counterparts. And secondly, in order to reduce ESG risks across the entire economy, across the entire system, we will have to be guided, and in order to improve ESG profile, we will have to be guided by their capacities and maturity, because Kazakhstan is an open economy that is actively integrated into various sectors. This is why it is so important for ESG profile of Kazakhstan upgraded carefully, especially taking into account that Kazakhstan is recognized as the brownfield economy that is dependent on crude commodities production.
That's very clear, and thank you very much for that answer. And before we sort of move on to a very big picture questions, we talked a lot about the company disclosure and what exchanges are asking the participants to do. So I wanted actually to tap into Oleg's expertise and ask you about what are the oversight responsibilities of the board members of listed companies. We talked a lot about greenwashing today, and we obviously need to make sure there's a internal procedure and oversight within those companies. So what do you think they are, or what do you know the responsibilities are, and what are the best practices?
Okay. Arek,
what shall the board of directors do, and what are the responsibilities of the board as related to ESG? Nowadays, it is quite a big topic, and I would even add that one of the most popular service is training for the board of directors, meaning what board of directors need to know about ESG and what are the best practices and what do they need to do to set up proper ESG performance within the company. From the perspective of various world's locations, we have some legal components that we have to observe. And according to such legal components, board of directors is responsible to act not only in the interest of the company, but of the population and community as well. So when we talk about this particular issue, about the board's performance in ESG field, so it's not only about the best practices measurements or addressing investors' needs or companies' long-term planning, it is also about legal compliance. Talking about components that are typically there with the board of directors, what they have to address. There are several issues to point. The first one is what we start with would be strategic session. This is where we evaluate materiality. And this is where the board of directors and company's management determine what are the key risks and key opportunities in ESG. And this acts as the foundation for further disclosure provisions, prioritization provisions, and during the very same session, we evaluate companies' risks. We make risk management approach, and all of this is then incorporated into the company strategy. In other words, the goal of the board is to cover these three dimensions: disclosure, strategy establishment, and integration of ESG into the company's strategy, and risk management. All of three dimensions have to be covered by the board, which means that they will address the needs and expectations of investors and the community. So during the entire cycle of the board, during the entire cycle of evaluation, the objective is to supervise the entire process. So the board of directors definitely have questions. What is the quality of the process? What is the depth of the process? And in the end of the day, as the outcome of this exercise, they have to share the strategy, high-quality strategy, the strategy that proves that ESG is incorporated in risk management, ESG is incorporated in disclosure, and in the company strategy. I would like to refer to the term that we haven't used today. We have greenwashing that has been repeated for many times, and this is improper disclosure of information. But we have other situation when the company is pretty straightforward and accurate. But nowadays, investors have specific questions. For instance, investors say, what is the date by which you are going to be carbon neutral? They don't care about general questions. They don't care about general environmental compliance. So when we talk about disclosure, there are specific certain questions. So our job is to find some balance when they do not do greenwashing, but at the same time, they do not go they do not go into the opposite side. So I think that this would be my summary of the major goals and objectives of the board.
Thank you, Oleg. I think that's a very exhaustive answer, and I think the key thing I sort of picked up from your conversation is that the whole process presents itself with opportunities, but also risks. So we have to manage the downside as well as upside in the whole process, just to make sure that that the process is obviously managed correctly. And before I move on to a question to Jerome, there's another question I wanted to ask to Medetbek, and that's something that Natalya said previously. And first of all, I want to congratulate you on the bond issuance, as Natalya said. But one question I had and I wanted to really ask you is about the role ESG reporting plays in supporting the national priorities. How do you see this? How do you see this question? Is that important to you? Is that important to the Kyrgyz economy, to the Kyrgyz stock exchange? And what are your views on this?
Thank you. Thank you very much for this question. In fact, during the roundtables with the ministries and the agencies, when we discuss a simple ESG report, we think that it takes the key role for the country's economy when we talk about sustainable development. In my speech, I have already referred to this, that Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan and many other countries have committed to Paris Agreement. And in order to be compliant with such commitments, the country will be driven by the market, the market where, let's take a mining company.
And we know that natural resources are actively used in the sector. So if companies do not disclose that information, then in the country, as per the Paris Agreement commitments, it will be impossible, to comply This is as far as national priorities are concerned. Then, for the economy to attract long-term sustainable financing through capital markets, obviously companies must disclose both financial and the non-financial information at a high quality level that is required by investors. If we want to develop further, we need to prioritize disclosure of ESG information because it plays a key role as far as the national priorities of our country are concerned.
It's an important point, I think applies to all of us, regardless of the state of development of the economy we are in. And I guess on a slightly different subject, we talked a lot throughout today about various international standards. We've mentioned GRI, we mentioned SFDR and all the standards. And I think we are lucky enough to have Jerome with us today, and his actual role is Chief of Standards Development. So I was wondering, Jerome, if you could do us a big favor and maybe just try to piece some of the puzzle pieces together. What's the link between all these international standards and how we should be looking at all this to have an overall picture of what's good, what's bad, and what we still should develop?
Well, thank you for your question. I think that what we've heard from our colleagues at the Kaz Stock Exchange is that the country of Kazakhstan and the neighboring countries, some of them have done the same, are developing multiple regulatory and quasi-regulatory instruments to promote more investments towards sustainable development, whether it's in the form of disclosure, whether it's in the form of corporate governance and codes for that, whether it's taxonomies, standards for bonds and loans, and so on and so forth. And so I think, one thing I can say in parentheses as a former chief of standard development at SASB is that we've heard a lot about materiality, and I think materiality and being someone at Bloomberg, you will know that is very critical to look at industry-specific aspects of ESG information. But more broadly, I think personally, what I see as the most important next step is to make the connection between all these regulatory instruments. And maybe with a view of selling or convincing companies of the importance of ESG reporting, I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about how they are relevant specifically for some of the other instruments or regulatory instruments that we could call sustainable finance frameworks. So we talked about the taxonomy, and one was just issued in Kazakhstan at the end of last year, and the taxonomy includes 7 categories: renewable energy, energy efficiency, green buildings, pollution, etc. All topics that are also found in the ESG reporting guidance of the Kaz Stock Exchange. And so, as you can imagine, the main application of the taxonomy is to allow companies to finance with loans or bonds. And in order to justify that the bond is green or compliant with the taxonomy, they will need to report that investments have been made in those categories. What's interesting too is there's an incentive that is built into the taxonomy in Kazakhstan, which is pretty rare, where companies who can demonstrate the compliance with the taxonomies will get up to 50% of financial support on the loan rates or the green or the bond rates. But to finish, I think one other thing that's important to connect is there's another trend in sustainable finance, and we've heard from Natalya how many bonds are coming to market, and these are typically user proceed bonds where issuers need to give specific details, and you touched upon that, on what investments are being made and the use of proceeds. There's also another trend in sustainable finance, which I'm sure you've heard of and some of you are very aware of, is sustainability-linked bonds and loans. And those are financial products where the interest rate is linked to the company performance on key material issues. So companies will get a better financial term from their bank or their investors on the promise that they will reach ambitious targets on key ESG issues or material issues. And then based on performance, the cost of capital will either go down or up based on performance. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is that, and Natalya spoke a lot about the importance of understanding performance, overall performance of companies as a key objective of the guideline on ESG reporting for the Kaz Stock Exchange. The only way that companies can demonstrate their performance on targets and ambitions is through proper ESG reporting. So I think what's important to realize, or my message, is that the regulators in Kazakhstan have done a lot of work to lay the groundwork for an ecosystem, if you want, that will start to build and try to make the connections between those different instruments is critical. And I think companies will benefit the most by taking, again, a proactive stance on reporting and trying to drive the narrative among investors, employees, on what they do to promote sustainability.
Thank you, Jerome. I think one of the things that you said really resonated with me, and actually goes back to the point that Oleg made about 5 minutes ago about key risks and opportunities related to the process. And you talked about sustainability-linked bonds and the interest rate or the cost of funding going up and down with companies hitting some of those ESG key metrics. And you can see this is a tangible example when you got risk and opportunities in the process itself, because you can be paying more for the loan if you're not hitting the numbers that you've actually committed to at the very, very beginning. So thank you very much for that. And one thing that obviously that you also mentioned is about the next steps. And as we are starting to sort of close our discussion, I wanted to turn to Natalya and ask a very interesting question. So just imagine now you take a time machine and we are here 12 months in advance in 2023, and what would you like to be able to say that you have achieved in Kazakhstan and Kazakhstan Stock Exchange in terms to ESG reporting? And I know it might be a difficult question to answer, but give it a go.
Thank you so much for this question. I love questions like that. I really love when I communicate with audiences to tell them what would be, say, if we implemented such and such ideas, or if we had implemented such and such. So what I would like to see in 5 years' time, in 1 year's time, is the following. When we started working on introducing ESG criteria and creating conditions for attracting ESG financing, we saw two problems facing us, two, say, objectives. First of all, absence of prepared issuers or companies who are interested in issuing green, social, gender, or any other bonds, despite the fact that projects for which these issuers were raising funds were actually green or gender or whatever. Say if KTZ is going to update or upgrade their fleet, they want to buy cars or whatever, that will improve the environment. But nobody actually called that issue a green issue. And also, we didn't see any investors who were interested in investing in green bonds specifically. What do I mean by that? Investors will not discount green projects, and they will not differentiate green projects from other projects. One and the same issuer will have the same risk profile when dealing with green bonds and non-green bonds. And what do we see now? And that has changed already. The situation has changed, and we will see this going forward. The scale of these trends will get even bigger and more tangible. So today, throughout today, we have heard many times from institutional investors and from other organizations, funds who invest in markets. We have heard from them. They want to make their portfolios more greener. That means that in their investment declaration, they will include issues of these securities. They will be interested in doing that because they have their own partners and clients who will spur them, and have certain conditions for them to comply with. So there will be certain amounts of money in the market that will be used for issues of green bonds at a certain discount compared to a regular bond. The second point that will have a positive impact on the market, and it was mentioned already, is the following. We have the so-called subsidy and guarantee government programs. So basically, the government slightly kind of helps the private sector to issue bonds under certain conditions, terms and conditions, by subsidizing the coupon rate or providing a guarantee for the repayment of the principal. So in those programs, when we have ESG credits, loans, or bonds, it's a positive thing as well, because that means that investors are interested. Accordingly, issuers now will be able to prove that this or such and such bond is a green one or is a social one. At the beginning, we approached companies with whom we work, and we proposed the following to them. Issue a green, social, or any other bond using your own framework. Just call this bond a green bond, and that will be enough, because investors will buy this bond as a regular, normal bond. Now we have made 2 steps forward, and at the exchange right now, you cannot call a bond a green bond, a social bond, because that will possibly be perceived as greenwashing. Perhaps that is not true, but it may be perceived as such. So you need to prove this. You need to be verified by an independent entity. And when money is used up or is being used, you will need to prove that you have used the money appropriately and properly. So we need to do all these things in parallel and try and resolve all these problems simultaneously, because otherwise I think nothing will happen. And I would like to wish myself and my colleagues in this hall to be successful in this, and hopefully in 1 year's time, in 2 years' time, we'll be able to share our success stories with you. And I would also like to wish our colleagues from other markets to be successful in developing in all these areas, and we'll be happy to listen to your success stories. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalya. Very, very interesting. And I hope you'll be able to say all those things next year when we meet. So I guess we've got a couple of minutes left, and we got a question from an audience, which I thought would be very interesting to end our discussion on. And we can make it a bit more interesting, and I will ask every single panelist to give me a very short answer, which can be 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, or it can be never. So let's ask Jerome to start off with. The question is about the divergence of or convergence of the reporting standards. So we think about accounting standards, and we've got IFRS, we've got US GAAP for the accounting part. At the moment, we've got plenty of standards in terms of ESG reporting. When, if ever, those standards will emerge and we have 1 or 2 unified reporting standards for the whole world or most of the world? Jerome, do you want to give it a go first?
I would say 3 to 5 years, but I would just also say that innovation is important before convergence. So it's not always a bad thing to have many different standards, because we need to innovate to get to the best standard before we converge to one. But I would say 3 to 5 years given the IFRS current efforts.
Perfect. Very brave and educated guess. Let me turn over to Medetbek. What do you think? How many years, if ever, for the convergence of the standards?
Yes, thank you. That's a very interesting question, and I was very happy to listen to Jerome when we were talking about this disclosure of information thing. We did deal with so many standards relating to disclosure. They're all great, but to unify them sort of at this stage is something unrealistic. It's impossible to unify them. But as Jerome has said, 3 to 5 years, I mean, that's realistic. Exchanges and also the market, I think, will be happy to learn that there are unified standards. There was this graph which showed us that 70% disclose information under FISDSD and GRI is ranked second. And we were focusing on GRI standards and SRB standards. And even there, we see that some markets use those standards and we use GRI SSB standards. I would love for us to be able to use those unified standards in 3 to 5 years' time so that all issuers are able to disclose information using one and the same or speaking one and the same language for disclosure.
Thank you very much. Very, very good point. And
Could I add something to this issue? So this question, I think, should be addressed to you, Arek, not to us. Why? I will explain to you why. We, as users of information, any information, financial, non-financial information, it's very important for us that information is sort of comparable. And we need to understand how companies change in time and how they develop going forward, and then we need to compare companies with each other. And such opportunities are given to us in the majority of cases by information hubs. In other words, agencies that consolidate information about different companies. And then in this consolidated form, they provide it to a wide range of users. That's why we feel very hopeful that Bloomberg will play a major role in this area so that this information hub can be used for ESG reporting. I do know you have done a lot of work already, so I hope that you will remain as innovators as far as this ESG information hub is concerned.
That's a very interesting question. And obviously, I have an opinion, but I'm quite selfish, so that's why I wanted to ask you about your opinion, because your opinion obviously is a bit more valuable to me than my opinion that I already know. So it's a very, very good point. I guess from the perspective of a data provider, what we're trying to do, we are trying to give this data to our clients in an accessible format. If I was a guessing man and how long it will take, I guess the journey we are on, we are still in a stage that there are plenty of companies that are not sure, don't really know what needs to be reported. And I think until we get to the stage where there's a clear definition of each standard and what needs to be done, I don't think we'll be on the way down to actually decrease the number of standards or have a bit of a convergence. So I'm also very conscious it's difficult to avoid groupthink when you ask an open question at sort of this type of an event, but I'll be a bit controversial and I will say it'll be more than 5 years. But I also want to hear what Oleg thinks.
Thanks. Коллеги, я согласен с оценкой.
Dear colleagues, I agree that 3-5 years would be the horizon where we will determine the dominating standards that will be mostly used. And I believe that there will be more than one standard that will survive, similarly to the financial reporting standards. Secondly, the second standards will be used in those geographies where they are the most convenient. This will drive the market.
And I guess that brings us nicely to the end of our session, We are 3 minutes late, so well done, guys, for timing. Not too bad at all. So I guess as a closing remarks, I just want to thank you very much for all the panelists. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you guys and having a very in-depth conversation. I definitely learned a lot. I hope you guys too, and the audience as well. And I'll probably say see you guys next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you.